Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. And this is now our 7th lecture in our series on global business. And you can see here from the slide, we're talking about the topic of cultural differences. Now, obviously, people around the world enjoy different cultures than others. And certainly, because this is an American class, we talk about United States culture. There are many, many differences in any other international marketplace. People enjoy different cultures, different ways of looking at things, different food, different art, different values, different ways of looking at society, different narratives on what is to be expected, what is good and right and normal. And all of these things must be considered when you think about selling or buying products and services in other parts of the world. Why? Because this is one of the layers, the major layers of complexity when we talk about conducting business in a global marketplace. In fact, you may remember that we were talking about in the very first lecture, what is global business? Global business is business with added complexities because you're doing business in a country that's not your own country. And you can see here from this slide, the chapter in the textbook ends up discussing 3 major forms of challenges, complexities, and perhaps barriers to successful international trade. You see them listed here. Social and cultural differences, which is what we'll discuss in this video. Economic differences, and legal and political differences. We'll look at those 2 in the next video as we conclude the series. But right now, we're looking at the fact that you are trying to do business with people who are different than you, potentially, because they live and enjoy life in a different culture. So how do we consider the complexities and challenges that are represented to us by perhaps wanting to sell our products to different types of consumers than we normally have in our domestic marketplace? This is where the long-standing work of a researcher by the name of Geert Hofstede comes in handy. Geert Hofstede was a social cultural researcher who worked with managers with IBM, the International Business Machine Corporation, which has an international footprint, and therefore they had managers working for the same company who came from different cultures, which provides a good bed of research, a good opportunity to research, generally speaking, women and men who have the same types of organizational goals, they all work for the same company, and yet bring to that organization their own personal set of cultural biases and beliefs because they've grown up internationally. Well, you see here the 5 dimensions of national culture that Geert Hofstede ended up distilling and describing as ways upon which to consider some people from different cultures may be significantly different than who you are coming from your own domestic culture. You see them listed there: social orientation, power orientation, uncertainty orientation, goal orientation, and time orientation. Now, of course, that chart is duplicated from your textbook, and so you can study it in more detail in the textbook. You see sort of the descriptions there, right? That for instance, the social orientation dimension at the top of that diagram means that folks may fall somewhere along the spectrum of being highly individualistic to being highly collectivist, and you see the definitions there underneath those labels. I won't belabor the point here because you can read this faster in the textbook than I can read it at you. So I'll trust that you'll study that in the textbook. But we can expand upon each of these 5 dimensional orientations in the next couple of slides. So for instance, one of the things to consider when you consider the cultural environment in which you're trying to do business is the social orientation. What, generally speaking, does the culture generally or typically represent in terms of a person's beliefs about the relative importance of the individual versus the relative importance of the group to which that person belongs. And what we're really talking about is there are long-standing cultural differences in, for instance, in American culture, where we tend to be, as thinkers, primarily emphasizing the rights and privileges of the individual to choose whatever he or she wants to do with their life, what he or she wants to buy, what that purchase may say about the individual, versus what does it mean that that individual exists as part of a larger culture, which of course in some Asian cultures is far more predominant of a thought than it is here in the United States. In the United States, how much do we spend time considering what does my purchase say about my ethnic group, or about me as a representative of that group or tribe or demographic, versus how much do we celebrate the rights of the individual to do my own thing? And that might in and of itself describe the difference between highly individualistic beliefs versus highly collectivist beliefs. Well, that's something to consider, because it will have implications upon you doing business with people from another country and another culture. Now you look at the second of the dimensions listed on the slide, power orientation, the belief that people in a culture hold about the appropriateness of power and authority differences in hierarchies, like a business organization. How comfortable are people with perhaps the fact that folks at the very top of the power pyramid, the folks who are the real decision makers, make exponentially more money, have exponentially more power than, for instance, folks at lower levels of the organization? And there are cultures which are very, very comfortable with this, and there are cultures where, quite frankly, they're very uncomfortable and question why is it the person at the top of the organization gets paid that much more than people at the lower levels of the organization. Again, something to take into account and consideration when you begin to do business with people from another culture. Three more of these cultural orientational dimensions. Uncertainty orientation, the feeling or the belief individuals have regarding uncertain and ambiguous situations. And the way this plays out, there are cultures which tend to be far more tolerant and accepting of uncertainty. In fact, they see that as an opportunity for growth, for opportunity, for risk to make a profit, and all those kinds of things, where there are some cultures which are very, very uncomfortable with uncertainty and would tend to prefer for things to stay stable the way that we've always done it, the way that for generations our people have done things. In the middle there, you see goal orientation, the manner in which people are motivated to work towards different kinds of goals. And that in and of itself, that description is very, very generic. I'm not even sure exactly what the heck that means. But what Geert Hofstede was really talking about when he labeled it goal orientation was the kinds of folks, on the one hand, who are all about accumulating material things and the social status which that accrues. Therefore, I'm working to afford an S-Class Mercedes and a Rolex watch and a big old stucco home in this particular community that's going to make me look good and status and all those kinds of things, right? Versus the types of cultural beliefs that says material things are not nearly as important as maintaining and maturing and fostering the social fabric in which we all exist as a community. And so you can see where goal orientation is at least somewhat proximately related to how collectivist a culture is and how those norms and values play themselves out in people's lives in terms of the goals that they work towards. Finally, you see here Geert Hofstede's last dimension, time orientation, the extent to which members of a culture adopt a long-term versus a short-term outlook on work, life, and other elements of society. And that is true somewhat with regards to culture, but also with regards to just experience and maturity. There are certainly cultures which have spent entire generations focusing on making the next generation better. And so one generation is willing to sacrifice as a cultural norm for the sake of the next generation coming up. One of the things that you see, for instance, in Asian American culture, just illustrated by the rise and now the fall of the Chinese restaurant in the United States. You may have noticed or grown up during a time when, hey, all you had to do was drive around the block for 3 blocks downtown and you'll run into 5 Chinese restaurants. All of them run by Chinese immigrants and folks who are working in that restaurant 7 days a week, rarely ever take a vacation. They seem to just be working their hands off. And what has happened here in the United States over the last 10 years is actually the number of Chinese restaurants in the United States has dramatically dropped. Chinese restaurants are closing for good at an alarming rate. And they did the research recently to find out what is going on and what does that mean for us. And what they found was very, very fascinating. What they found was so many Chinese old husbands and wives who had spent their entire adult life since coming to the United States running that little restaurant, saying, yes, this restaurant is closing, it's closing for good, and we couldn't be happier. What is going on there? That's just an alarming, a strange response, isn't it? Well, not actually, because if you ask them, well, why did you spend your entire career running this Chinese restaurant? So many times they will tell you, we came here to the United States decades ago, and we had nothing. And the only thing we had was the skill to cook. So we opened a restaurant, we worked our fingers to the bone 7 days a week, rarely taking vacations, for one primary reason: so that our children would have the opportunity to go to a good college, that we'd be able to afford it, and that they would make something better with their lives by becoming either doctors or lawyers or engineers and those kinds of things, right? In other words, what these old Chinese couples tell us is that the reason we opened this restaurant is so that our children would never have to work in this restaurant. In fact, if they had to work in this restaurant, it would mean that we failed in what we were trying to do. And so the fact that they have now gone on to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and all those kinds of things, those professions that in many ways Asian American cultures laud and celebrate, right? That means that what we did worked. In other words, when it comes to this whole issue of time orientation, parents like that were working with a very long-term time orientation rather than the short-term, what can I get now? How can we benefit our lives now? They were looking ahead, not even their own lives, just beyond their lives, into the lives of their children and building their emphasis and focus there. So what does this mean? Well, it means that there are at least 5 different ways that potentially cultures can inform individuals' beliefs and values and norms, and therefore influence the way that they look at the world, and therefore look at how people are supposed to, what their beliefs are about how life is supposed to work in business. However, we have to say at the outset, just because these 5 potential dimensions exist out there, it doesn't mean that we should stereotypically presume because someone comes from this particular country, they must be this way, or because they come from Sardinia, because they come from Italy, because they come from the Ukraine, because they come from South Korea or China or Japan, they must be this way because the research suggests the culture informs these values and beliefs. Why can't we make that stereotypical assumption? Well, at face value, because you're stereotyping people, right? In other words, just because I'm American, it doesn't necessarily mean that in all business decisions I'm going to tend towards this direction. I'm going to have these values and norms. I'm going to naturally think this particular way. There's the potential for that, but for goodness sake, I'm an individual with my own story and my own journey, as are you if you are watching this particular video, right? Just because your ethnic or cultural background has roots in a particular place, it doesn't mean I can presume all sorts of things about you without getting to know you, right? Well, the same is true in business. When you are doing business with someone from another cultural group, from another country, it means that you need to be open to ask the questions and do the research, knowing it is quite possible they may have a set of values and beliefs that are informed by their culture, and yet they're also individuals, and therefore they may have significant differences from what a particular set of research or tendencies might suggest about people from that culture. So I hope that's helpful, and at least helpful for you to see why this is an added layer of complexity that gets added on doing business in a global marketplace. It makes it more complicated. Doesn't mean it can't be navigated, but it's certainly something that needs to be considered and deliberately navigated for the sake of building communication and trust in business. Hope that's helpful. More on this in the textbook. We'll see you in the next lecture.